Part 11. Near Ballingarry, County Tipperary, 29 July 1848. The world became strangely quiet after the battle, not silent, never silent. There were still sounds, the wind moving through the hedgerows, the distant calls of men searching the fields, the occasional hoofbeat upon the road. But the great noise was gone, the shouting, the gunfire, the movement of hundreds of men, gone. Ciarán lay beneath the hedge and watched the leaves above him. They moved gently in the breeze. It seemed impossible that such a peaceful thing could exist, so close to what had happened. A few hours earlier, men had been firing upon one another. Now a small bird hopped along a branch only a few feet away. Life continued without concern. Patrick remained beside him. Eamon sat nearby, silent. Neither man had moved, neither had considered leaving. After some time, Ciarán spoke. "Is it over?" Patrick looked toward the fields. "Aye." "Did we lose?" The question was not bitter, only curious. Patrick took a long time before answering. "I suppose, yes." Ciarán nodded. He looked almost relieved. "At least you're honest." Patrick managed a faint smile. "You always did hate when people pretended." For a while they said nothing. They had spent months filling sentence with conversation. Now silence itself felt like something precious. Eventually Eamon spoke. "Do you remember the first day we met?" Ciarán smiled faintly. "The bread, aye. You thought I was going to steal it." Eamon shook his head. "No, you looked like you were going to steal it." "I was hungry. We knew." Ciarán closed his eyes. "I was very hungry." Patrick looked down. "We know." "No." Ciarán opened his eyes again. "You don't." The two men became quiet. "I don't mean that badly." He struggled for breath. "I mean, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be a person." Patrick looked away. The words hurt more than any wound. "After my family died," Ciarán paused, "I thought that was the end. My father, my mother, my brothers and sister, everything." He swallowed. "I wasn't angry, not even at first. I was just—" He searched for the word. "Empty." The wind moved through the grass. "I slept under trees. I ate what I could find. I stopped talking because there was nobody to talk to." A small smile appeared. "Sometimes I walked through villages just to hear people speaking." Eamon wiped his eyes. "You should have told us." Ciarán looked confused. "Why?" "Because," Eamon struggled, "because we would have understood." Ciarán smiled. "I think you did." The sun began lowering. Golden light touched the fields. For a moment, it almost looked like any other evening. Patrick reached inside his coat. He removed the small piece of cloth where Ciarán had wrapped the stone from his old home and the green ribbon. "You still have them?" Ciarán nodded. "I carried them everywhere." Patrick placed them carefully in Ciarán's hand. "They're yours." Ciarán smiled, not for much longer. Patrick looked sharply at him. "Don't say that." Ciarán gave him a gentle look. Patrick, the older friend, looked away. "Don't." Ciarán squeezed his hand. "You gave me something." "What?" "A reason to keep walking." Patrick shook his head. "No." "I did." "No?" Patrick's voice broke. "You did that yourself." Ciarán considered this. Perhaps he was right, perhaps not. Maybe courage was something shared. Maybe people borrowed strength from one another until they had enough of their own. As evening approached, distant voices grew louder. The search parties were returning. They could not remain. Patrick knew it. Eamon knew it. "We need to move." The words felt impossible. Patrick looked at Ciarán. "I'll carry you." Ciarán smiled weakly. "You won't." "I will." "You won't." "Why not?" "Because—" Ciarán looked at him. "You already carried me." Patrick stared. "What?" "When I had nothing." A pause. "When I was nobody." Patrick lowered his head. "I was not a soldier," Ciarán continued. "I was not a patriot." "You are." "No." The answer was gentle. "I was just hungry." Eamon laughed through tears. "You always were stubborn." "Aye," Ciarán smiled. "That part hasn't changed." They heard movement nearby. The moment was ending. Patrick leaned closer. "If anyone ever asks—" Ciarán opened his eyes. "About what?" "About you." Pause. "I'll tell them you were brave." Ciarán frowned slightly. "No." Patrick looked surprised. "No?" "Tell them the truth." "What truth?" Ciarán smiled. "Tell them I was frightened." The two men stared at him. "Tell them I didn't know what I was doing." His breath became weaker. "Tell them—" He paused. I just didn't want to leave my friends. Neither Patrick nor Eamon spoke because there was nothing more truthful to say. The light faded, the fields grew darker. The rebellion was finished. The leaders would soon become names in history books. Trials would follow, prisons, exile. The world would debate what the rising meant, whether it had been foolish, whether it had been necessary, whether it mattered. But beneath a small hedgerow in Tipperary, those questions did not exist. There was only a young man and his friends. Kieran looked once more toward the sky. I never got the dog. The words surprised them, then they laughed. A broken, sorrowful laugh. You're still thinking about that? A good dog, he paused, is important. Patrick held his hand. I know. Kieran smiled, and for the first time in many years he did not look like a man who had lost everything. He looked like a man who had found something. Part 12, near Ballingarry, County Tipperary, 29 July 1848. Patrick did not remember leaving, not properly. Years later he would try. He would remember the road, the rain, the sound of boots moving away, the weight of his own footsteps carrying him from the hedge. But the moment when he released Kieran's hand, that memory remained blurred, as though his mind itself refused to accept it. They had stayed as long as they could, longer than they should have, but staying meant all three of them would be captured, perhaps killed. Kieran understood before they did. That was the cruelty of it. The dying man had to convince the living to leave. Go. Patrick shook his head. No. You have to. No. Kieran smiled faintly. You always were bad at following orders. Eamon laughed despite himself. He's right. Patrick looked between them. Even there, they were still friends. Eventually Kieran closed his eyes, not because he was giving up, because he was tired. Promise me something. Patrick leaned closer. Anything. Don't remember today. Patrick frowned. What? Don't remember the battle. The words surprised them. Remember before. Kieran opened his eyes. Remember the barn. The cards. The terrible singing. Eamon smiled. You were the worst singer. I know. Everyone knew. Kieran looked toward the fields. Remember the bread. Patrick's face changed. The first day, the beginning, a starving young man standing at the edge of a crowd, not knowing that the smallest kindness could redirect an entire life. That was the first good thing that happened to me after... He stopped. After the famine, after the deaths, after everything. Patrick understood. The bread. Kieran nodded. The bread. They sat with him until they could no longer stay, not because they wanted to leave, because love sometimes demands the most painful thing of all, to go on living. Before they left, Eamon removed the green ribbon from his own arm. He tied it around Kieran's wrist. No. Kieran looked at him. You keep it. Eamon shook his head. No. You were one of us before this. A pause. You're one of us after. Kieran looked at the ribbon, the same colour as the fields outside the ruined cottage, the same colour as the hope that had carried thousands of men into the rain. Patrick placed a stone from Kieran's old hearth beside him. You keep home. Then he touched the ribbon. And you keep us. Kieran smiled. That's a lot to carry. Patrick nodded. You always were stronger than you thought. They left. Not long after, soldiers passed through the area. They searched fields, roads, hedges, farmhouses. They found many volunteers. Some were arrested, some escaped, some disappeared into the countryside. History would follow many of them. But no report recorded the name Kieran Burke. No government document mentioned him. No newspaper described him. No politician spoke of him. The last of the Burkes died beneath a hedge, and the world continued. Years later, Patrick would sometimes wonder if that was unfair. That men who had shaped events were remembered, while men who carried those events were forgotten. But then he would remember something Kieran had said. Don't remember the battle. Remember before. So he remembered. He remembered a young man who could barely speak when they first met. A young man who looked at bread as though it were treasure. A young man who slept lightly because he had learned the word could take everything away. A young man who slowly learned to laugh again. He remembered Kieran sitting beside the fire, reading the newspaper slowly, learning words, learning ideas, learning that his voice mattered. He remembered the day Kieran first called them friends, though Kieran probably never realised that was what he had done. And years afterward, when someone asked Patrick why he joined the Young Ireland movement, he rarely spoke about politics. He spoke about people. He spoke about the men who had marched, the men who had been hungry, the men who had been frightened, the men who had stood together. Was it worth it? Sometimes people asked. Patrick never had an easy answer, because how could anyone measure such things? The rebellion failed, the leaders were imprisoned or exiled. Ireland did not become free in 1848. The government remained, the suffering continued, the world moved on. But Patrick would sometimes think of Ciarán Burke, a young man who believed himself forgotten, a young man who had lost his entire family, a young man who had been reduced to surviving one day at a time. And then he would remember something. Ciarán had died believing he was loved. Perhaps that was not victory. Perhaps it was not the victory men write histories about. But perhaps for one forgotten young man it was enough. Many years later, an old man walking near Ballingarry stopped beside a hedgerow. He didn't know why. Perhaps he simply felt something there. He looked across the fields, the same fields where men had gathered, the same fields where dreams had ended, the same fields where frightened young men had stood anyway. The old man removed his cap, not for a politician, not for a general, not for a famous name, but for all the unnamed people who had carried Ireland's history upon their shoulders, for the Ciaráns, the Patricks, the Eamons, the thousands whose names disappeared, but whose lives mattered. Because history is not only made by those whose names are remembered, history is also made by those who lived it. And sometimes the most important stories are the ones nobody wrote down.